for being here today. You all know better than anyone that one of the most important and challenging things that leaders do is to change mindsets. Those of you involved in the Pritchard Committee in the early days knew that was one of the greatest challenges that you faced, and you did it so excellently. Bob Sexton and Susan Perkins-Weston, or Susan, there you are. You knew that was the job when you created the Top 20 by 2020 report to say, why not? Of course Kentucky can be in the top 20 or the top 10 or further. It's what Dr. Carroll Johnson did as superintendent of Memphis City Schools when she put banners all over the city that proclaimed Memphis City Schools, every child, every day, college bound. It's about changing mindsets and changing the strategies so that students, all students, can achieve at high levels. Bridget shared with you about the basics. I'm so glad that we're starting today with the first, with bold leadership, because you'd be hard-pressed to find the rest of them. The basics, you would not find them if you do not have a strong leader and a leader who embraces the community and parents and students to make it happen for kids. I want to give you a couple places where you can find more information before we invite the panel up here. The Pritchard Committee, y'all know our motto is inform, study, and engage. So the first thing we're going to do is inform you. You have in your packets a one-pager, front and back, called Kentucky School Leadership Landscape. I want to thank Jenny Adams from the Educational Professional Standards Board for helping us with this process, as well as Tom Shelton and a few others. Wanted to give you a view of what the data look like, what some of the emerging issues are in the field, and what some of the really strong initiatives are that are underway across the state. You'll see that Kentucky Association of School Superintendents has a new program called the Executive Development Program. It's through the National Institute for School Leadership. And Tom tells me they'll be expanding it into a superintendent's academy. You'll hear a lot more from Dave and Ron in a few moments about the Leadership Institute for School Principals that is led by the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. Also wanted to make you aware of the Principal Partnership Project from the Kentucky Department of Education. Jenny Ray will be here today. I don't see Jenny right now, but she'll be here today. She's doing phenomenal work, really helping principals in a cohort model, providing on-site support. Jenny Ray was also my math teacher in high school, and she's awesome. So those are some important things. We will be publishing a report based on this information and based on today's discussion, so be watching for that. The sheet also gives you some reports that you can look at from some of our national partners, such as New Leaders, Public Impact, and others. Finally, after the panel has its discussion and we'll have some time for Q&A, we'll have a break, and then Bill Wilson will lead us in some group facilitated exercises so we can process what we've learned and provide recommendations back to the committee. So with that, I'm absolutely delighted to invite Dave, Ron, Gary, Jennifer, and Dr. Johnson to join us on the stage. Let's get started.
And then introduce our special panel this morning. I'm Dave Adkisson with the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, and Bridget, I want to tell you publicly what I've said privately. We appreciate our valuable partnership with the Pritchard Committee on so many fronts. One of the publications that's back there is the Citizen's Guide to Kentucky Education, which we co-published earlier this year, and it gives, I guess, a 25-year history of some of the things that we've done. Bridget just described some of those. some of the achievements that have been made in Kentucky, but also some of the challenges that remain. So I hope you'll pick up one of those. Our chamber is primarily a policy organization working on behalf of the business community to try to create a better economic environment in Kentucky. So we have issues relating to taxes and environment and energy, and we work with the legislature, with the governor. Sometimes we're in the courts trying to pursue that. But the number one priority of our chamber was reaffirmed in 2008 by our board of directors, and that's the improvement of educational attainment in Kentucky. Our history goes back to pre-CARA days of when the business community was outspoken on behalf of improving education in Kentucky, back when the informal motto was, we're 49th and we're not going to take it anymore. Business leaders have been involved, but it is still the top priority of the Kentucky Chamber. A few years ago, we decided that it was not just enough for us to go over to the legislature and beat on the door of the governor and tell them to fix things in education. We needed to roll up our sleeves and do something also. Diana Taylor, who's a consultant to the Pritchard Committee and a consultant to our chamber, there's a lot of inbreeding here on our consulting work, but Diana knows when to put one hat on and the other. But she looked all over the country at the types of things that businesses were doing for education. And there are a million things. You know, you could give book bags to fifth graders, you could give laptops to middle schoolers, you could send an apple to the teachers on Appreciation Day. You could guarantee a 13th and 14th year to your students who do well in high school. A million things you could do. We had to decide what we could do, what was within our power, within our price range, frankly. And so we settled, after a fairly deliberate process, on school leadership, principal leadership. And we decided to put some of our eggs in that basket, and we have now done that for 6 years. We looked across the country for a partner, and we came down to two: the Center for Creative Leadership in Greensboro, North Carolina, and Harvard's Graduate School of Education. We decided to partner with CCL, the Center for Creative Leadership, because their instruction is all about leadership. It's all about you, your strengths, your weakness, how you motivate a team, how you motivate a faculty, how you get better student scores. It was not a graduate school of education that obviously has an education bent, which is a great thing. We wanted to go with the pure leadership, plus some of the top corporations in Kentucky: Brown-Forman, Toyota, Papa John's, the Corvette plant operation down in Bowling Green. Use the Center for Creative Leadership for their up-and-coming executives and send them there. It's expensive. It was $9,000 per principal, but in the last 6 years we have now sent 300 principals through that and invested about $3 million. Now here's the class from July of this year, one of our two classes this year in Greensboro. They go there for 3 days. The next slide, Corey. We celebrated our 5th anniversary, brought people in from the Bush Institute in Dallas, and the Presidential Library, and Laura Bush is all about principal leadership. Had some great speakers. Next one, Corey. So we've had 323 principals, $3 million, and there's some of the outcomes that we've reported. The principals come back and say, we've never had anything like this. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to be treated as professionals by the business community. It's good to have a pat on the back by business people who seem to care. So it's been very positive for us. That's the good news. The bad news is that we're probably sending half of the principals that I think we should be. You look at the turnover rate, I think we ought to be sending 100 principals per year, and it's just a matter of fundraising. It's hard. Another weakness is going into rural areas. You know, if you go into a county that has a grain mill and 2 branch banks and a service station, it's hard to raise the $9,000. We approach community foundations, we've had Rotary clubs, we've had individual businesses to do that, but we would like to do more. So that's a little bit of what we've been doing, just to make the point that our business community in Kentucky has made a strategic commitment to principal leadership as kind of our cause. So with that, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel. The more I read about these folks, the more I wanted to hear from them, and I want to learn from them. Jennifer Carroll is with us. Jennifer is Project Director for Appalachian Leadership Laboratory. And they pull together leadership teams to work on how they can improve their leadership skills. And she's currently the president of the Kentucky Association of School Administrators. Corey, do they have this biographical material?
Do.
Good. So I won't read all this to you, but just to highlight, Ron Chi, Dr. Ron Chi, he's on the board of directors of our Leadership Institute. By the way, the board is half CEOs and half education leaders of our institute. He served as a former, an advisor to former Secretary of Education Arnie Duncan. He's got a tremendous background in innovation and how to scale innovation across schools. And he's currently the Chief Innovation Officer for Kentucky State University and the Frankfort Independent Schools. So Ron, thank you for being here. And by the way, he's generally very enthusiastic. He's good to hear from. Not that the other three aren't, we'll see, but I think they are. Dr. Carroll Johnson, an amazing background. Superintendent of Boston Public Schools, Memphis Public Schools, Minneapolis Public Schools. Have you ever had a real job or anything? It's amazing. But she's now Regional Executive Director of Programs with New Leaders. So she has studied leadership, especially at the urban school level, and brings that background to us today. And then, last but not least, I passed over, Gary Houchens. Gary is at WKU, and if I heard correctly, the Wallace Foundation has just done something amazing with you guys. I want to hear more about that, and I hope you'll address that. Yeah, Department of Educational Administration at Western Kentucky University, and he was just appointed to the state school board by Governor Bevan, so glad to have you on that school board. So, I understand the rules of this, and Corey will come up here and hit me in the knees if I don't do this right, is for me to kind of stir things and move it along. So Carroll, we'll start with you. You have such a strong record of prioritizing school leadership as the superintendent in Memphis, Boston, and now helping districts throughout the region. How do you make the case that educational leadership and school leadership specifically is a priority? And what are the most important capabilities that effective leaders need? Dr. Johnson?
Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me. And let me start out by saying that I have been impressed for several decades with the work that Kentucky has led in terms of transformational work. And so I congratulate you and the Pritchard Committee in particular for really being on the forefront for quite a long time in addressing some of these important issues. I've been a school principal, and I think that times have changed. And the demands are very different than they were when I was a school leader. The demands for students, what we want in terms of outcomes, what we expect, what our community wants. It's very different than it was back when I went to the University of Minnesota to get a license to be a principal. I didn't go through some leadership special program, but there was a principal preparation program. So I think that second to the quality of teaching, the research has really said school leadership is by far the most important ingredient in terms of improving school performance. 97% of all teachers say that who is the principal matters in terms of them coming to a school, in terms of them staying in a school. And with the increased choice that families have always said that they make a decision about where to place their kids, where their kids are going to go to school, not just solely on how the building looks, but how they feel, how they're treated, whether they believe when they walk into the school that that principal is going to make sure that the school is safe, well run, and that the teachers are motivated and inspired. They know the names of the students. They're really connected. And so the whole set of skills that are really, really important in terms of building the kind of school leadership work. I will say that what I think has also changed is this. We've increased our focus on the lowest performing schools. And so while the kind of leadership programs that we traditionally had in the past met the needs of schools that were doing okay, I think that to transform the schools that have significant underperformance requires a set of skills and mindsets, a set of systems to be in place to get the kind of outcomes that we want for our poorest, usually in our most vulnerable children. And so when I came to Memphis, we invited a partner to join us in that endeavor, a program called New Leaders. And one of the reasons that we invited them was because of the elements that they had in place One was a rigorous selection process where people had to really go through a process of being selected. And then secondly, there was a residency, not unlike a medical residency, for a whole year with one of our most talented principals. So working alongside somebody who really knew the work and had already evidenced success, so that we knew that they were being taught and modeled after a great school leader already, and they weren't just in a school watching any principal, but they were learning in an environment. And then a lot of attention to 5 standards that we talk about, which have to do with instructional leadership being at the core, that the principal's job is really about creating the conditions where instruction is the top priority, learning is the top priority. A big focus on personal leadership. We believe if you, and this is tied back, I think, to your comments about the Center for Creative Leadership, if you don't know who you are, if you haven't developed yourself personally, you really can't lead anybody else. And nobody else is going to want to follow you either. Big focus on adult and teen. We believe that a lot of times people get promoted to being a principal because they were a great teacher, but they can't lead adults. And and sometimes people get promoted to central office because they were good at the school level, but they cannot lead adults. They cannot build a team. They can't inspire others. And then we focus also on culture and community, kind of the mindset that all children can achieve if given the right opportunity. And then finally, we do focus on operations and management, but that's a really low priority because that has been such a high priority in the old traditional model of education.
Thank you very much. Did I do that? Is it on? Okay, there you go. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you in a minute. Dr. Chi, you've been through our Leadership Institute. You're now on the board of that Leadership Institute. What do you, talk about that experience, and then also what else do you see on the horizon for leadership opportunities for school leaders in Kentucky?
So in taking part, first of all, to be empowered to be a part of something, of a discovery, first initially within yourself to understand your skill sets. That was eye-opening. Before, you almost restrict yourself because you don't have certain capabilities or abilities. And took the Myers-Briggs, I am an INFJ. If you look it up, it says you're rare. And I'm going,
Not that rare, right?
okay, good. 50% up here. But how does that fit into a system? How does that, how are you able to really not just see yourself, but to see others? It was very much eye-opening to understand that it's okay to be different, but then you have to quickly recognize who surrounds you and how you can utilize the gifts of others, to utilize skills, to understand that you have a responsibility to empower those with abilities to be a part of systematic changes and growth processes. That's real. And the most eye-opening thing is that if you don't have that a part of your leadership effort, and adults forming at a level that you are strategic, that you're intentional, that you hold others accountable, it will never happen in the classroom. Never. The beauty of that experience also extended me outside of the classroom walls. That is really engaging community members to be a part of processes, to absolutely grow the system together. I'm telling you, I'm looking at Pam Miller. I don't know if Pam realizes she empowered me as a community member. She was the mayor of Lexington. She started Summer Shades in Lexington. She started Summer Shades in my classroom at Wimber Middle School as a science teacher. From there, I realized that it's not an alone walk, and I think that with regards to CCL, it is eye-opening that building administrators of the future really needs to know how it is a shared vision. It is shared leadership. It is a shared process. Another aspect of shared leadership, student component. I wouldn't be here on the stage without Trey Grayson. Trey Grayson stopped me cold and said, if you don't want to be a medical doctor, I was a medical school student, at the Governor's Scholars. I was his RA. He challenged me, said, "Do you really want to be a doctor?" Years and years of parent pushing to be that top 1%. Years and years defined Ron Chi to be this. Years and years that I wasn't in my passion. It took a student leader to recognize the abilities. That all came out within my experiences at CCL to understand, oh, you've got framework. You've got a sandbox to really play. And all these leaders who've been a part of all of our lives, that's the experiences that building administrators have to be a part of.
One thing I'll mention about the program too is that CCL told us the best time for a principal to go through the program was after their first year of service in their leadership career. Now, other programs, as Carroll said, are for aiming at distressed schools or that sort of thing. We decided to put a premium on early principals, early in their career. It was not a program, it is not a program for trying to rejuvenate someone who has perhaps reached the end of their rope, and that is just not meant for that. There's a place for a lot of different types of training, but that's one of the unique pieces of CCL. Gary, in the last 10 years, a lot of things have come online in terms of educator preparation in Kentucky. You've been on the forefront of some of that in your institution. What do you see on the horizon for programs across Kentucky?
So I speak primarily from my experience at Western Kentucky University, where I am involved in the principal preparation program and working with teachers who aspire to become school leaders. But I'm familiar with what's happening at many of our state institutions across Kentucky in leadership development. And so I can say that about 10 years ago, we went through a major effort across the state to improve the quality of principal preparation. That work was led by the Professional Standards Board, and there was a major emphasis on the principal as instructional leader. So playing off of the kind of research that Carroll talked about, it's evident that principals have an impact on student learning. But we've come to realize that that impact is very indirect. So principals impact student achievement through their influence on teachers, primarily. It's the way they build the academic capacity of the school through their relationship with teachers. And so increasingly we're starting to understand that whatever the principal does, all of their energies should be geared toward helping teachers improve their instructional practice, because teachers are the #1 avenue through which we can impact student learning. And so throughout our principal preparation program at WKU, and I believe at the other institutions as well, we put a heavy emphasis on that role of the principal as instructional leader. So whether you're talking about school law or budgeting or working with the community, everything should funnel through that lens of how are we leveraging these activities to improve student learning. And so we've had some real success with that in our program at WKU. The newly designed program is now in starting its 4th year. But I think we all recognize at Western and elsewhere that there's still so much work to be done to improve principal training. And there's nothing inherently magical about doing your principal training at a university, but there are some real advantages to doing so in that universities should be the place where innovative research is taking place, cutting-edge ideas are being articulated, ideas that challenge the educational status quo should generate in a university. And so it makes sense that that kind of vibrancy would feed into the training and preparation of school principals. Unfortunately, what we also deal with this tension of being removed from the field of practice, and it's the challenge of being relevant to the kinds of work that principals are actually engaged in each day. And so I think increasingly we're aware of the need to become more closely tied with our district partners to work much more hand in hand with the schools and districts that we serve. From the very beginning of principal development, which would be when those teachers are identified as potential leaders, So many folks tell me, and it's certainly my experience as a former administrator, as a teacher, I never dreamed of being a school principal. It was only when a principal whose opinion I really valued said, you really have leadership skills, you ought to think about that became a reality for me. So universities have to be much more closely connected to schools in identifying those teachers who have that leadership capacity early on, all the way through their training and then through their work on the job. So in those first critical years of a principal's career, the universities still need to be tied into the schools and districts in order to identify where those growth areas remain and help to facilitate the leadership development, whether it's through the university or through a program like the Leadership Institute that helps keep those principals on the cutting edge of practice and able to translate their work into real student results. So at WKU this week, we were able to make a really big announcement. We were very excited that on Thursday, we were able to share that WKU is one of 7 institutions, 7 universities across the United States that have been identified for a Wallace Foundation grant that is going to provide substantial support to continuing our redesign work with principal preparation. So we're going to be working with the Green River Educational Cooperative. Rec is our key partner in this work. We'll have technical assistance partners from Wallace and other institutions who will be working with us to take our principal development to the next level. And part of what we'll be looking at doing there is putting our principals through training that mimics the kinds of best practices that we want them to be leading out in their schools. So we'll be looking at personalization of the learning process. We'll be looking at competency-based instruction as a key method by which we guide our aspiring principals through their training. And we'll be partnering with GREC and the districts that we serve to create a data tracking system that will help us identify these aspiring leaders early on and determine their growth needs over time to create a more fluid process. And I'd say above all, one of the things that we want to do is help the principal understand their role as a leader of innovation. So this is part of the relevancy issue for universities, but I think for educational institutions in general. We recognize now, I think, that the way we've always done school is not going to be sufficient to meet the educational challenges of the 21st century. And so we've got to prepare our leaders not only to be effective in schools as they are, but in schools as they will become and should become in the future. And we want our principals to be able to participate in that conversation and help articulate that vision of what schooling might become in the future. So this grant, obviously we're very excited about, and we hope it becomes a model for what other institutions in Kentucky and elsewhere can do in terms of building those partnerships and being as relevant as we possibly can be for principal training in the future.
Great. Thanks very much, Gary. Jennifer, tell us more about the Appalachian Leadership Lab. How do you leverage that network to support leaders, and what successes have you seen?
Well, the Appalachian Leadership Lab is a project of the Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative. It was made possible through a Race to the Top district grant that the co-op received in 2014. That grant had 6 big areas of work assigned to it. It had things like personalized learning for students and educators, health and wellness, college and career readiness, different aspects of teaching and learning, but the one thread that we saw through all of those things was leadership. And we have the vision or the idea that leadership really is, when you boil it all down, it is about improved teaching and learning. And with that vision of leadership, it comes to the fact that leadership is the work of everyone in that school. That a principal alone cannot have the knowledge, the capability, the expertise, or the time to be that instructional leader that is able to provide coaching and guidance to teachers, that's able to take care of the operations of the school, that's able to lead teachers through professional growth and development. But there's just a lot of work there. But they have the expertise within their schools and within their districts with their teacher leaders. So the Appalachian Leadership Lab, it was in its development year last year. We brought together a group of folks who represented shared leadership across their schools and districts. Teacher leaders, principals, the central office folks who serve those schools in an instructional capacity, and community members. And they engaged in some action research around what makes great shared leadership teams in a school? What makes those teams function well? They all chose a problem of practice that they wanted to solve in their schools and districts so that they could come together as a shared leadership team around that problem of practice. And through that work and through that action research, they created a framework of responsibilities and practices that represent what good shared leadership teams do in a school. They also developed a theory of action, that if this is what we want for our students, then what are the roles of each of those folks on those shared leadership teams? What must a teacher do in order to get those results for students? What must the principal do to support that teacher to get those results for students? What is that role of that central office person in supporting the principal and supporting the teacher to get to those results of students? And how do we engage our communities in real ways to support that work? So our design fellows, they really help to create that sort of, just for the lack of a better word, the scope and the sequence of what the future cohorts of the Appalachian Leadership Lab would look like. So this year, we are in our first full year of operation. We have teams from 12 districts, 15 teams from 12 districts who are working together. They have identified their problem of practice. They've identified what is that challenge that we want to work on together. And so now we are engaged in a year of personalized professional learning for those teams to enable them, to empower them to be able to solve that problem of practice. We engage in monthly face-to-face meetings where we find the experts that are related to the problem of practice that they are working on. We've had training so far from Mike Rutherford and Tom Murray from the Alliance for Excellent Education. We've had our own experts from our region to come in and help prepare those shared leadership teams. Some of the problems of practice that they're working on, we have some that are working on personalized professional learning. How do we make sure that all of the folks in our building are getting that professional learning that they need to make the impact that they expect for their students? We have some shared leadership teams who are working on student engagement, that they know that as they look through their classrooms that there are kids who are not engaged in learning. So they're engaged in action research around what are those strategies for student engagement, and then how do we work together as a shared leadership team to ensure that everyone has that professional knowledge that they need to improve shared leadership. Successes, we're still in our beginning phases, but I think anecdotally that we can look at the fact that these folks have engaged in a lot of research and a lot of work. They have created that shared leadership framework. They have created that theory of action. They've all identified a problem of practice that they are working on to improve what is happening in their schools. They have gone down the road of exploring different models of professional learning. We've got to move away from the 6 hours sit and get. Everybody's going to get it whether you need it or not. They've really latched onto the idea of micro-credentialing professional learning. And we have partnered with Digital Promise to create micro-credentials around shared leadership. And our first one is going through its final review by Digital Promise right now. And it will be offered to everyone in our region or anyone who wants to participate in that type of competency-based professional learning. So we're excited about that. So I think our successes are more evident in the work. We do have plans. I mean, we have external evaluators through our Race to the Top grant through RAND. And we also have, you all know that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation came into our region last year because you've seen some work that the Gates Foundation identified as good work through like Betsy Lane. I think you all heard from Ricky Thacker and Cassandra Akers. And they are part of our Appalachian Leadership Lab. They were part of our design fellows. And so just having the Gates Foundation kind of help give us some guidance around where we're going and making sure that we're thinking about how we can replicate this work, not only in our region, but beyond. So the successes are more anecdotal, but we do have plans to look for how is this impacting our professional learning goals for our teachers or for our staff? How is this impacting our student growth goals that we collect through our state professional growth and effectiveness system? How is it impacting TEL results? We have the TEL survey in our state. But we do have those measures that we're looking for, but right now we are we're just looking at what is the impact on school by school, because success is going to look different school by school based on the problem of practice that they have identified.
Great, thank you very much, Jennifer. They have all mentioned the relationship between principal leadership and teacher growth. I'd like to go a little bit deeper into that. Are there new ways that we need to be thinking about how you observe teachers, evaluate teachers, support them? And I would add one, and the way in Kentucky we select them. Any thoughts? Any other?
Well, I think I want to piggyback a little bit maybe on Jennifer's comments, because I think what we learned through the work with new leaders, where we were mainly focused on aspiring principals, that what we learned maybe 5 years ago, and new leaders has been in place for about 15 years, is that if we just trained the principals, it would not be enough. And so we went back and created something called emerging leaders, where we are developing teacher leaders. Some of them may become principals, they may not, but they are going to be leaders in the schools that they're in. And they do work with like a cohort of, like all the third grade teachers may be working together on a problem of practice, like Jennifer mentioned, or it may be the math team at a middle school, where they're really trying, and they're very focused on the problem of practice. It's really about student results. But I think that our emerging leaders end up being really teacher leaders, and what we found is a lot of the aspiring principals that we've trained, and now they're principals, they ask us to train their emerging teacher leaders in their buildings. They may be PLC coaches, literacy coaches. They may not be in what we traditionally think of as a leadership role, but I think we're changing the definition of leadership. We're broadening the definition when Jennifer talks about the shared and distributed leadership. We're saying that our entire company, if you will, every employee has a responsibility to lead in a way, and it won't just happen magically. That is, we have to continue to develop people, because learning is not static, right? You have to just keep at it, and we're always learning new and different things, or new and different demands. And so with our aspiring principals and with our emerging leaders, I think we've done that. The other theme that I think I heard across all of us had to do with partnerships. And I think that I used to think, you know, as a school superintendent, well, we can do this all by ourselves if we just get everything lined up. But I do think that there's huge value in external partnerships who can both look at the world differently than we do in a very insulated way, but can stretch our thinking. And they may be higher ed, they may be external business community, but we have to figure out ways in which the traditional public schools actually partner with others to accelerate the performances necessary for our poorest kids. And I think the most recent research says that the gap between poor students and middle class students is larger now than the gap between black and white students. So there's this huge income and then academic gap that has to be addressed if we're going to see substantive results.
I think Kentucky's taken a bold step in recent years to improve the quality of teacher evaluation and performance feedback. And that, of course, was represented in our professional growth and effectiveness system, which was really a response to what everyone knew, which was that teacher evaluation was not a very effective process. It has not, in Kentucky or elsewhere, done a good job of distinguishing between high and low performers so that everybody's getting an appropriate level of feedback. So PGES comes in with all of these great best practices for delivering teacher feedback in using multiple data sources, peer observation, teacher-established growth goals, many of the things that folks have said for years need to be a part of the system. Unfortunately, as we've gone to implement it, and it's the same issue that we've seen in many other states, we're still ranking roughly 95% of our teachers as effective or highly effective. And I have to be careful here, because the truth is that we have many effective and highly effective teachers in Kentucky. But you know, there is a developing category in which we would expect most teachers who are junior in their career to be in that developing category. They're not being identified that way. And so, you know, I'm aware that the Department of Education is doing a lot of work with principal training and superintendent training right now to try to address that area. But what it seems to me is we have one of two problems. Either we have principals who can't fully identify and articulate what those effective teaching practices look like, or they lack the courage, the emotional courage to have those difficult conversations with teachers. And to me, that goes to the kind of personal leadership that Carroll was talking about in her opening comments that is so important, is that we, in addition to teaching principals technical knowledge, we've also got to work on their self-awareness and their communication skills and those personal affective dimensions that will give them a greater capacity to have those coaching conversations with teachers that we really need them to have.
And I guess I'll just say, it's not just knowing yourself, but knowing how you come across to others.
And it's also about knowing the talents that you have within your building. I think, a good principal thinks about the growth and evaluation of their staff through that lens of the reciprocity of authority. So if I'm going to ask you to improve at something, then I have that responsibility to help you do that. It's not just like a chef where you say, this dish isn't good, make it better, without any guidance about is it too salty, is it too sweet, did I burn it, what did I do? So if I'm going to ask you to improve, then I have that responsibility to help you to do that. And probably I don't have that toolbox of resources to help you do so. But within my school, I have the talent of my teachers. So I guess really one of the roles of a principal then would be a talent scout. How do I find what those talents are in my building, and how do I link those people up for that continued growth?
I would say that there is a balance with regards to being open as a building leader, to be vulnerable, to have it clear that you don't have all the answers or even the vision. It is a collective shared vision, and for teachers to feel that they've been empowered to build that, especially now. When we talk about design processes, it's not controlled by one individual. It is absolutely opening the possibilities, and for teachers, for educators, for community members to feel that they have that opportunity really opens up possibilities that you as a single individual would not be able to generate, facilitate on your own. I think that there's another aspect of leadership is intentionality, and for you to really know where you're wanting to go, just like good teaching. It is exceptional when you have all the framework that has been designed throughout the state of Kentucky. But if you don't utilize it, if you don't implement all the time that has been invested in those documents will remain as documents. And I think that with regards to also finding the right people, you have to be intentional. You can't look at a math position and go, here's an exceptional math teacher. Based on what? Based on academic scores that move up? Or based on that individual being able to grow capacity within the classroom, being able to, really build upon the leadership, student leadership. You can't discover that within a 45-minute interview process. You've got to change how you select, how you vet, how you, go about in really looking at it as an opportunity to grow that is not necessarily there. If you have the challenges of an old system that has you employing people, and it's a 45-minute, 12-question process, and you know that you're not going to get to the depth of the individual, why do we continue to do that? And that's a bit of that intentionality.
I was going to say also, I think there's an author by the name of Liz Wiseman, and she's written a book called The Multipliers. It's really not so much about school people, but what she says is that you kind of pay people for this level of work, right? But you really need them to do this level of work, because the work is like more than what the job description says. And that really great leaders get people to do lots more than they ever imagined doing, because they multiply people's capacity to perform. And the other piece of this, though, as I think about as building principals work in the context of a school district. And to the extent that principals feel comfortable taking a risk to evaluate lots of teachers in their buildings, both fairly and appropriately, they have to be sure that the people at the district level will respect, honor, and back up, right, their decision-making. Because I think that's another piece of it. I know when I had to go to Washington at one point with Arnie Duncan in a meeting, and he said, I don't understand why you can't get your best principals to work in your lowest performing schools. And I had to come back and think about that question. So I found my best middle school principal, and I asked him to go to the lowest performing middle school in the district. And he said, I will on these conditions. And it wasn't about money. It was about, I have to have this control, I have to have this support, I have to have this autonomy. And if I have those and I can pick the teachers and I can do this, then I will go work anywhere. And I mean, he did, and he transformed that school in 3 years. But it is making sure that the central office also complements the work of the principals that you charge to make the big changes in terms of evaluation.
Okay, we've learned a lot here from these high-powered education experts. It's time for a quiz of them. Short answers, please. What does the term distributed leadership mean to you? Okay, we're going on to
We're trying to distribute the leadership.
I think looking at what we're doing with our shared leadership teams in our region is that distributed leadership or shared leadership looks different school by school. Because every school is organized differently, every school has different, it's a different size, has different teaching capacities, different strengths, different talents. But really it is about how we come together, how we access the leadership expertise that we have in our school through real roles. You know, a lot of folks that we are working with, they believe they have teacher leaders in their schools, but those teacher leaders aren't able to really exercise real influence. So how do we ask those folks to take on real roles where they are working side by side as a shared leadership team to focus on what's the impact that we're looking for on student learning, and then how do we work together to do that. But I think distributed leadership really has to look different school by school. We haven't been able to come up with one true model that works. We've asked folks to come together, and we had a sort of a minimum. As you came in with your shared leadership team, we want to make sure you have a teacher leader, a principal, a central office person who serves that school in an instructional capacity, and a community member. Well, it didn't take long for that team structure to blow up, because then we had folks who wanted students on their team. They wanted to have vertical teams. They wanted to ask folks from, if they were in middle school, they wanted to ask folks from the high school to be on their team. And you have to let them organize the way that they work the best in order for that shared leadership team to have that impact.
Any other thoughts?
I'd say it's building capacity with regards to building systems process, to really understand how every skill, every individual within that system is absolutely knowing where their value is and how it can impact systems of change. Whether it's within the school, whether it's within the community, whether it's all of us, that's to me what true distributed leadership is.
Anything else? Carroll?
Well, I do think it requires a level of humility, because you don't have all the answers. No one person can. And so being humble in this work, I think, is just really important.
And I would say that requires not only a shift on the part of the way the principal thinks about his or her role, but the way the school community thinks about the principal's role as well. Because we've got to find ways to make the job of the school principal more on a human scale. And we have expectations of school principals that we would never have for similar types of managerial leaders in different industries. You know, when was the last time you called your doctor's office and expected to talk to the doctor on the phone without an appointment or any advance notice? We don't do that, but we routinely expect that of our school principals, and for them to be available and have the information to solve those problems, you know. And so there's a shift that needs to take place in our expectations and our understanding of what the principal is if we want distributed leadership models to really work effectively.
Thank you. I'd like to press a little harder on this issue of the selection of principals. In Kentucky, we've had an issue lingering in the legislature about how school councils select principals. Our organization has lobbied on behalf of superintendents having a greater role and got a bill passed to that effect a year or two ago. Jefferson County, I think, Franklin has some special issues there about how principals are selected for distressed schools. What is your impression of how we can advance that? The selection of the right folks for leadership roles.
Well, prior to selection, I think development is really important. So before we get to the point of selecting, we should make sure that we provide a lot of different experiences and leadership opportunities, whether it's on the distributed leadership team or on the instructional leadership council, so that people have some practice and experience. And leaders, they go through a very extenuous process of selection, which we do jointly with the school district, but the school districts we work in, and the leaders is in 5 regions of the country. I'm in the South region, but we work very hard to try to, do everything from sort of in-basket activities to looking at the results that they've had in the past in terms of the selection. And then I think that once you select people, then you really have to continuously invest. I think Tennessee looked at the principals that had been selected back in, I think, 2013. And of the principals selected, about a third of all the principals in the state of Tennessee had been hired within the last 3 years. And so, and then 68% of the principals that were recently appointed had been assistant principals. And about a third of them, about 20% of them had been teachers and went right into the principalship across the whole state. So I think that it's really important that we define the skills and the knowledge we want people to have. We develop programs and partnerships with other people to make sure that they have some of those experiences in advance. And then again, I'm a strong advocate for them having some residency experience before they get thrown into this with a very talented principal, so that they get to practice the difficulty. This is a tough job, being a school leader. It's very demanding. It has lots of aspects to it if you're going to see substantial improvement. And I think what we heard from the speaker, Dr. Puffy, yesterday, Kentucky is not looking for getting to proficiency. You think proficiency is a low bar. You want to make sure that you're at the advanced and above level of competition. And to get to that really requires a whole different level of, I think, leadership at the school level.
College of Education design teams really need to respond quickly to teacher leadership in having them fast track into the administrative world. Teacher leaders get it here in Kentucky. We fall short within our educational departments to support them. In many respects, we're still dealing with old programming, with coursework curriculum. And it is a challenge right now, but I think that our state is positioned to respond to the leadership that's coming, grassroots. I feel like that through the clinical work to open up our schools to that type of potential, it's not just necessary. We're losing time. And I feel like that, again, our shared vision, our shared efforts will get our College of Education to truly reset, revamp, and really lead in those areas.
Ron? I'm Gary.
I would just say I support the position of KESS and KESA that the role of the superintendent needs to be strengthened in principal hiring. I can't think of any other industry where a person is responsible for evaluating an employee that they only had a limited hand in selecting for that role, or not at all. And so I think there are a lot of ways that effective superintendents can engage the community in the selection process. But at the end of the day, I think our current system really ties the hands of superintendents in significant ways to select the right people particularly for high-need schools.
A few superintendents have approached us at the chamber with the idea of creating a cohort within our Institute for aspiring principals. Aspiring principals. And would we be interested? And we've said, well, yes and no. Yes, we would be willing to do that. We're thinking about trying that next year. But we've said to the superintendents, we're not where we want to be yet with putting forward enough opportunities for principals themselves. As I mentioned a while ago, we'd like to double our numbers of principals going through our program. So if the superintendents would be willing to write the check for an aspiring, seriously, if they would be willing to fund that, we'd put together a cohort, of course. So that's kind of where that is in the discussion stage right now. I'm also reminded by some of your responses on the selection of principals. In the business community, there's a growing trend toward using the social sciences and various methods to evaluate, or at least come to understand the social intelligence of a particular job candidate before you hired them. Billy Harper was on the selection committee when I was invited to come back to Kentucky and take the position that I'm in now, and they said, go online, fill out this form, we'll see how you match up with our expectations. And it's a bing, 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 10 minutes later, and there's all this data that is run through the computer models as to whether or not I would be a match for what they were looking for. Big data is being used by a lot of companies to decide whether or not somebody is a particular match. Is there any of that going on in the education community where there's fairly sophisticated professional assessment of the emotional quotient, I don't know what you would call it, goes beyond Myers-Briggs and that sort of thing, to see whether or not a person has those skills that you need to lead a faculty? Any thoughts?
Prior to coming to WKU, I was the district administrator in the Simpson County Schools, and for many years they had used a whole battery of personality assessments and aptitude assessments with applicants for teaching positions and especially for administrative positions. And it's an interesting process. At no point is a person ever disqualified because of a particular score on a particular assessment, but the goal is to get a richer picture of who the person is and how they might function within the context for which they are being considered. And so I think, based on my experience with that and what I understand from that district, it greatly contributes to their understanding of their candidates and better hiring decisions.
We use that with all the candidates for positions in our shop now, and I have learned through painful experiences that if we're wrong and go against what we're seeing in those evaluations, we're really wrong. And you don't see that after 2 hours of an interview. So anyhow, I think we're ready to kind of open it up to the audience here to quiz these folks on things. Bill, you have a question?
Yes.
There's a microphone behind you.
Oh, sorry, I'm not used to microphones don't work anyhow, but anyhow. You got it.
Is it green?
Projectors.
There you go.
The question I have is as it relates to principal training and teacher training or any type of school training. Do you all know of any type of training, or is it part of any curricula, cross-cultural training?
There are dimensions of cultural proficiency that we build into our administrative preparation program. I can't speak to pre-service teacher training. Julia or Mary might be able to speak to that. But I know we do integrate elements of cultural proficiency into our coursework. That is another component of our redesign. So as our candidates are going to work in diverse school settings, sometimes much more diverse than what they themselves have been a product of, and so we want to make sure that that is built into their training program as well in a more effective way and more thorough way than we're currently doing.
It is integrated into new leaders, but I think all of our programs fall short of the kind of preparation that helps really prepare people for the real world that they're going to confront in our schools, particularly our schools that are becoming much more diverse, both racially and linguistically and economically. So I think it is an area that we have to continue to find ways, and we tend to bring in external partners to help deliver that portion of the curriculum, but I think it increasingly needs to be addressed. And one point that I was going to make just in the last question was about in Jacksonville, Florida, the superintendent has selected kind of a handful of 20 assistant principals that he's prioritized above all the other, as in a pipeline, and so we're developing them. They're not principals yet, but he sees them as instructional leaders potentially if they get the right training. And those folks we're taking to some more extensive work around cultural competency because it is in a larger urban district.
Bill, follow-up comment or anything? Okay, great. Scott Davis from Henderson, who, by the way, rounds up money in Henderson to send principals through our program. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the segue into my question. So, Dr. Johnson, you touched on the need to have partnerships between the broader community and the school system. Do you see specific models, communities that are really strong with collaboration, what they're doing in communities, the private sector that come alongside the school system to assist with leadership development for not only principals but emerging leaders? Places we can look to, you think that here's a good example of collaboration?
Well, I think that clearly I'm in Memphis, so we do have lots of partners that we collaborate with, much like you're describing here, to support the leadership development work that we're going to do. Some of it's philanthropic support. Some of it's, we have an advisory board in New Leaders in Memphis, and they are made up mostly of business leaders and people who are just interested in improving the opportunities for school leaders, but also teacher leaders. I think that Kentucky is fortunate to have a lot of interest in education in the both philanthropic and business community, and I think that's been in place for quite a long time, and I think that's been true at least in some parts of Tennessee where we have these partnerships. But I think school superintendents, school board members, and others have to be open, right, and transparent, and be willing to share the data that we have about what's working and what's not working. And I think there is a reluctance.
Yeah, and I was going to say that's often the challenge, is that transparency factor to let somebody from the outside in.
We do have better data than we've ever had before. It's much more public than it's ever been before. I've looked at some of your progress in Jefferson County on the NAEP scores, and it's been pretty impressive. So I think we have much more data to look at, and increasingly, when we can be honest about things, I think that the community is willing to step forward. I think they have to see that we're willing to change, that it's not just the status quo.
You know, I bragged on Henderson and Scott down there. Let me give you a practical example of how some of that collaboration has come together in Hopkinsville. Down there, through their chamber and through specifically a banker, Elizabeth McCoy down there, she has a reception at her home. Their goal is to raise enough money by passing the hat at that reception to guarantee that every year Hopkinsville Christian County will have 2 principals available if accepted into the leadership program. So they've made that commitment. After the principal goes through, the Chamber of Commerce introduces them at their monthly breakfast, brags on them, shows them to the community, brags on the sponsors. The newspapers there gets pictured, big thing in the newspaper about the principal going through. That kind of recognition, I think, means something to most people. And so that's where the media, the business community, a banker, and the school leadership come together to celebrate some good things going on. Other questions? Right back there. Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to be the person who always says, so you talked about the community and involving the community. Define the community and give us some idea how you are including families. I volunteer in 2 priority schools as just a reading volunteer. And one of the things that I find the principals really struggling with is how do I incorporate families to the point that families want to work with us and want to come alongside and be partners with us. So is that something that shows up in the preparation of principals?
Jennifer, you've done something, haven't you?
We have. I think the key to that is to give families a real reason to be engaged, a real reason to be involved, and not just ask for them to, show up on a given night for a family event. So our shared leadership teams are really doing a good job of tapping the talents of our folks in our community, of our families, and asking them to come to the table and help us to analyze our data, help us to plan a path moving forward. But just within our cooperative, all the different things that we have going on, family engagement is a really big piece of that, and probably the biggest area that we have family engagement is around that area of health and wellness. In our region, we have a lot of kids who are coming to school without their basic needs met. So we have a component of our Race to the Top grant that is just about how do we help parents to make sure that the needs of their children are met. And you get a lot of involvement when you start talking about we want to help you take care of your kid. So I think having a real reason for those parents to be at the table is probably the very first most important reason and most important way to get their engagement.
Ryan?
To get into, just again, the potential of working on the system and engaging families, Kentucky State University has a great opportunity to revamp the special ed department. To have those families at that front table as thought leaders, to really expose what we have done with regards to, let's say, acquired learning disabilities through all old systematic processes. And we all know what we're talking about with regards to we've damaged kids. We've labeled them way too early. To now have the family members, to have those who have seen it and are crying out not for help but for solutions, to be a part of that designing of solutions, and being a single cord with regards to how we service our kids. That's where we are right now. And just 2 weeks ago, it was an amazing thing to open up our Franklin County, Frankfort Independent community for those parents who didn't have that voice. It was almost always reactive, but to have that proactive voice, to be at that lead table, again, this is where we are with regards to systematic processes.
I think that the other piece of this is a mind shift, a mindset shift in terms of respecting the parents as having assets and not just seeing them as coming looking for something, but they bring to the table. When we focused on the 11 lowest performing schools in Boston, we had planning teams, and every principal had to have evidence that they had parents really actively engaged in coming on the team and giving input. So it's doing with parents, not doing to parents, I guess, is the change. And that's hard because with our most vulnerable parents, we've tended to think they don't know what they want, and they actually have a very good sense of what they want for their children. It's about how we listen to that.
One of the examples that I should have shared earlier is through a partnership that we have with the Cooperative Center for Literacy Development in our region. All of our families in our 19 school districts, they are eligible to participate in the Dolly Parton Imagination Library. So all of our families every month are getting a book. So what we're trying to do with our cooperative is to provide professional learning for our families about, okay, so you have this book. Now here's what you can do with your child to help them to be able to read that book, to learn from that book, and sort of just doing training with them around that. So I do appreciate what you say about recognizing that our parents have those talents and have those capacities, and how do we help build on those.
And we had a program called Technology Goes Home, because a lot of our parents don't have really good technology. And so we got companies to give us old computers we've refurbished, or, you know, not old to us, but, you know, they turn over very much. And then Comcast provides $9.95 for a month for people to get internet if they're below the poverty level. So we had a lot of our parents, and they just had to come to so many Saturdays of training, so they were proficient as a family to learn how to use the computer at home.
I guess as a follow-up to that question would be, so how do we get principals open to engage, especially the families of the most vulnerable students? Because from the work that I have done over the years, we noticed that for children who struggle, they often have parents who are struggling in their own literacy skills, as well as their own other kinds of issues that are happening. So how do we get principals, and I'm particularly interested in the principal preparation part, because that's something that many people come to a principalship because without.
Right. And that's one of the, we have a number of clinical experiences that are built into the principal training program. And one of the clinical experiences has to involve parental and family engagement. So one of the things we're trying to do early on is get those folks accustomed to working with parents in a different kind of way than they simply do as a classroom teacher. And so we've had a lot of great examples of that, a lot of great projects, several of which involve health and wellness, where our students are doing that work out there in the field. But that is another area for us to grow in, and in really building better clinical experiences early on, so that our aspiring principals are thinking about it in that particular way. I think particularly for teachers who come out of struggling schools, I find a lot of folks who they approach parents with almost an attitude of we're adversaries in all of this, and we have to wrestle with each other to do what's best for kids. And so there's a mind shift that has to take place to really see our parents as our allies and not our adversaries, and that starts early on in that process.
I think it's particularly true for Ron's point about special education parents. They don't know how to advocate sometimes, and they feel very frustrated about how to get services from us. So the partnerships you're talking about.
Well, Franklin, then Emmanuel, and then Sam. And then we're probably going to have to shift gears.
So we heard how important it is to have good leadership with superintendents and principals, building the partnerships within the community, and it just kind of makes you wonder that if you have, I think we've got over 170 school districts in Kentucky, a lot of rural states have a lot of small districts. I mean, I think all principals are very busy, whether they have 2,000 students or maybe 500, although I guess you could say a really good principal could impact more kids if they have 2,000 instead of 500. But anyway, just going to the superintendency, you think about how difficult it is and the resources that go into training and getting all this stuff put together. And yet we have superintendency, maybe you only have 1 high school and 3 elementary. I mean, is it just too difficult to even talk about, or should we really be thinking about some economies of scale? I mean, if you were doing it over again, you wouldn't have 175 school districts. Then you might have, what, 50 or 60 or something like that? And then you have 50 or 60 really good superintendents who have got enough schools that it really makes a difference and that they can really implement. I guess what I'm saying is it unrealistic to believe we're going to have best practices that you all were talking about in 175 school districts?
One of the ideas...
Pritchard Committee calls for consolidating all school systems.
I said, is it not even practical to talk about it?
Film at 11.
I can't believe he's bringing that up in a state that is so basketball oriented.
You still have a high school, so every county still has a high school. This question is, you have a different superintendent over a couple, 3 different county systems.
Gary?
So some of you all know Dr. Justin Baffin at University of Kentucky. He's doing some great work with supporting innovation, and he helps run the Next Generation Academy that they do for teachers and school leaders right around the issues of innovation. I recently had a great conversation with him where he was really promoting the idea of networks of schools, and some of the models we see of this. I'm thinking in particular Owensboro Independent, and some of their innovation work has been done through their partnership with New Tech. And so this is a network of schools where they get the benefit of the experiences of all those other schools that have been down these pathways before. They get tapped into the same professional development. It's expensive, of course, and the community has been very generous in trying to support their involvement in New Tech, but it's a model of what I think might be possible for a lot of other districts, particularly the smaller districts, to pool their resources and help one another. You see that already on some basis through our cooperatives. And so our cooperatives are really dynamic places where a lot of this kind of sharing takes place. I think networking might be another level of that, where schools with very specific needs could work with other schools that are similar to them and share ideas and support each other around their specific growth needs.
Coming from my region, if I were to agree with that idea, they probably wouldn't let me get back on the Mountain Parkway to come back home. But I think,
But that's the problem.
I think-
Because the whole Carroll thing changed. We had school superintendents who were building political fiefdoms, and that was part of the problem. That's why we didn't trust them to pick principals, because they were going to pick the rabbit instead of the right.
but I think.
Pritchard Committee doubles down, calls them.
But I think we have to look at how are we supporting the growth and development of those superintendents. They need that personalized professional learning as well. And those ideas about networking them to learn from each other and making them part of those shared leadership teams, I think is critical.
And that's part of your training and development for local boards of education members as well, so they understand how all those dynamics are.
We need to have 2 more questions and then we'll move on. Emmanuel, you had a question, I believe? Bridget, sorry about your job.
Emmanuel Washington, thank you for your comments so far. There's been a lot of research and some proven statistics on the agonizing hardship and the psychotic play of transient students. So you can have the best superintendents, you can have the best teachers, the best principals, even the best PTA staff, parents included, and you still have a problem. So I wanted to really, pick you all's brains and see the insight or some of the solutions that you all have developed with your vast communications throughout and leadership throughout the educational system with transient students in particular.
Carol, I assume you've dealt with that in urban
Yes.
settings.
So we did a study that showed in Minneapolis that elementary students who had been in more than 3 schools in their elementary years performed lower than students who were stable during that period of time. I said that once though at a meeting, and a guy stood up and he said, my kids have been in a lot of different schools. I'm in the military. My kids are doing well. So I want to couch what I say with the fact that there are lots of kids who move around a lot because their parents move in the military and so forth, or jobs. But they have an infrastructure at home that supports them through that transition. And so they're not as negatively, I'm not saying they won't be negatively impacted, but they're not as negatively impacted. For our poorest families, the instability of home life and school life interplay. The McKinney-Vento Act is a federal act, tells school districts that when a child is homeless or intermittently homeless, the districts are required to try to stabilize the school environment and try to keep them in the same school whenever possible. Obviously, that's not always possible given the high mobility. I think that what principals and schools have to do is try to figure out how we're going to modify and adjust. But it is very hard for teachers when a kid comes in January, February, or March, and they haven't been with you all year, and suddenly there are big, huge gaps in their learning. And so I think that the staff has to see that as a proper practice, particularly in our more mobile schools, and try to figure out what infrastructure we can put together to welcome them. I've been in schools where they put all the new kids up every month that are new to the school, and they do special things. They assign them to a student partner. They do things to mitigate a kid feeling isolated and alone. And so I think that's what leaders have to figure out how to do.
Okay, thank you very much. Sam, why don't you ask a question and close out this portion of the program?
Very quickly, before the question, an editorial comment. I'd suggest that Board Chair Gelsma's mother, a long-term education advocate in Kentucky, does not condone those radical ideas. As Pritchard Committee members and as concerned citizens, I suggest most, if not all of us, are and have been and continue to be very concerned about achievement gap issues. How do we raise achievement overall? A 2-part question. From your all's perspective, how does bold leadership at the local school level potentially impact that situation? And the second part, I'll ask my own controversial question. Is it fair to hold building leaders accountable if we're not able to close those gaps?
If we stick with the current accountability system, it makes no sense. We quickly as a state have to define all these new measures that come into play, it opens up the possibilities for the building administrator to truly be creative, but not just their respective staff. Their students have to be a part of the component with regards to how do we really measure effectiveness. It's not education alone, it's all these agencies, it's the community that comes into play. And you know, I don't know if we really realize the beauty of what we're trying to establish with Commissioner Pruitt's accountability task force. And I think that if we continue to kind of look at student achievement based on the old system, it's a trap. If we quickly lead with regards to some of the measurements that, again, opens up learning, and is truly a learner's paradigm, then I think amazing things are going to be in store for our state.
Okay, we've just got a few minutes left. In rapid fire fashion across, any parting thought for the panelists about maybe that one thing that you think should be done to more adequately prepare and support school leaders?
I want to echo what Dr. Johnson talked about. It's very unfortunate that in our state that our residency or internship programs that we had for principals have faded away, and that breathing new life into those and networking across all of our partners with KASS and KASA and those folks to really create an Educational Professional Standards Board. You know, that was something that they had tried to get through the legislature last year. We really do need those programs back to support our principals.
I would echo exactly what Jennifer has expressed, also opening up a greater population of our building leaders to programs such as Principal Institute, funded by or supported by CCL. I think that there are other businesses that we're considering to open up that space of learning, as well as NISL. So those type of efforts are critical.
I think it'll take a multitude of strategies, several of which we've named here today, but the critical goal, I think, for us needs to be that every school has a visionary school leader. To me, the great crisis that we face is that too many of our school leaders carry out a kind of passive approach to their work, where they wait for the State Board of Education or the Department of Education to tell them what to do next. We need principals who understand what good instruction looks like, and they have a vision for their school that is clear enough and strong enough that we can change the accountability system again, which inevitably we will. We can change the testing system again, which we will again. We'll change curriculum, and yet that school keeps maintaining its focus on high quality instruction. That's critical because we have so much to celebrate in this state and the progress we've made. But the rate of that improvement is insufficient. And if you just look at our NAEP scores are continuing to go up, but at the current rate of improvement, to reach just 80% proficiency in 4th grade reading will take us 50 years. To reach 80% proficiency, which is, I think, a minimum bar in 8th grade math, it will take over 100 years at our current rate of growth. So the efforts of this organization and all of the different organizations we represent here are going to be vital to accelerate that level of improvement, and school leaders are going to be right at the heart of all of that.
Dr. Johnson?
So I think that we have to develop and this is partly the last question that you asked, leaders who see equity and excellence as not mutually exclusive and are willing to understand that the achievement gap is in part an opportunity gap, and we have to figure out how we're going to increase opportunities for students who are not reaching this far. And also, I would argue, for the students who are reaching proficiency but who could be at advanced.
Great. By the way, I've been asked to announce that there's a special breakout session. Franklin Gelsma will lead a session. School consolidation. It'll be in the bar. No, seriously, back to his point about, and any conversation about government in Kentucky eventually you'll hear the phrase 120 counties. In education, if you talk about efficiency at all, you have to think about these school systems. And I'm more usually drawn into the conversations about government, and I don't think I'll live to see 120 counties down to 119. But that doesn't mean that you can't have functional consolidation of the sheriff's department or the jailer or the EMS or whatever to create efficiencies around functions. And I think that was the answer that some of you all gave about schools, whether it's innovation or foreign languages or whatever, that kind of consolidation can and does need to take place, because we don't have a system that's rational in the system, in the sense that any of us would have created it this way. So, Franklin, you're redeemed. Yeah. The chairman of the project committee. Thank you all. Let's give them a round of applause.